Hey everyone! I thought I'd round out this impromptu mini-series on tenant organizing with a conversation with some comrades from the Pasadena Tenants Union. In the last episode, we heard from B, a tenant organizer in Pasadena, a city in Los Angeles County. Today, I'm joined by two of her fellow Tenants Union members, who worked really hard to pass Measure H for rent control and eviction protections in Pasadena. Ryan, Aaron, and B of the Pasadena Tenants Union were some of the most active campaigners for Measure H. The measure was a ballot initiative to amend the Pasadena City Charter, adding citywide rent control and eviction protections, as well as establishing a rental housing board to implement the law. As you can probably imagine, landlords and landlord associations representing their class interests fought pretty hard against this measure. They threw a lot of money at an opposition campaign, which culminated in a legal challenge to the measure. Ultimately, the legal challenge failed, with the city successfully defending the law in court. There's a lot of messy local politics I won't go too deep into, but it's important to understand the context for why Measure H matters. And if you live in a city anything like Pasadena, and especially if you've been involved in similar organizing efforts, this story probably sounds pretty familiar. Getting tenant protections established is really hard. You're fighting an ownership class that has a lot to gain from the continued exploitation of tenants, and laws like this threaten their profits. At least when those profits rely on being able to extract over half of someone's take-home pay or social security checks, neglect the health and safety of their tenants, or even evict them on a whim. Pasadena is a microcosm of the stark racial and economic inequality in the U.S. According to a 2019 report by Occidental College, Pasadena has the second widest income gap between rich and poor of California's 50 biggest cities. Pasadena is, on average, more economically unequal than California and the United States as a whole. Histories of this inequality, as well as redlining and racial covenants, are clearly visible in the city landscape, where multi-million-dollar homes and lavish amenities sit just a few blocks away from the poorly maintained apartment complexes run by slumlords. So as you can imagine, the fight to get this measure passed really brought class tensions to the fore in Pasadena. On the face of it, it might seem like just another electoral campaign, but my guests today saw it as something more. They saw an awakening of political consciousness, and an expansion of the horizon of possibility for people who have unfortunately been very accustomed to having their voices ignored. After the break, we'll hear the perspective of on-the-ground organizers from the Pasadena Tenants Union on the state of tenants' rights in Pasadena, how this measure changes the playing field, and what they learned in the struggle to get it passed. Before we get started, though, I just want to say I would really like to be able to turn podcasting into my career. So if you like this show and want to hear more, please consider supporting me with a donation. And also rating and reviewing the show or sharing it with your friends are both super helpful. And now, on with the show. You're listening to Solarpunk Now, the podcast about politics, science, art, philosophy, and whatever else it'll take to get us out of this mess. Join us, and let's demand a brighter future together.
My name is B. I use she, her, they pronouns, and I came to Pasadena originally to get my environmental engineering PhD, and have stuck around to do tenant organizing and was the field director for the Measure H rent control campaign.
Hi, I'm Aaron Levy. I use they and they pronouns, and I am in a physics PhD program in Pasadena, and then during the Measure H campaign was the point person on field kind of activities during the signature gathering, and then uh, also part of the kind of campaign for the ballot in November, and have been in the PTU for 5 years or so.
And hi, I'm Ryan Bell. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a tenant here in Pasadena. Been a member of PTU for, I guess, about 6 years, and was previously evicted from an apartment I lived in Northwest Pasadena, and got involved in PTU after that, and was on the steering committee for the Measure H campaign and was the finance coordinator.
So I want to start by setting the stage a little bit and just speaking very abstractly. I'm curious how each of you would define politics, sort of like what the bounds or scope of the political looks like to you.
I've often said everything is political. Um, I have a hard time really exempting anything from the political realm, though I suppose it depends on, you know, how what we're addressing at that moment. But I think like everything from, what choices we have, how much freedom we have to make have a full range of choices in front of us as people, whether we have free time or not, whether we have some money from our income to spend on things that we choose and not just on life's necessities, like even the recreation that we have available to us, and all of those things are political. So I always have a hard time when someone says, "Oh, I'm not really political," because I'm not sure like what that means actually.
Yeah, I think if you're saying that you're not really political, then you're making a pretty clear political choice that is largely like a status quo political choice, and that's very disappointing to hear when it happens, and I think is yeah should the political should be expanded in those cases.
Yeah, I agree. I think pretty much most everything in our lives is political, especially when you think like, oh, the president of the day doesn't really affect my day-to-day life, but what does is my boss, or the fact that I have to rely on a car to get places. It all comes back to politics and who's in power and making those choices for me. So there's very little that I would say is not political, if anything.
Politics is about power and who has it and who doesn't, and I mean that comes down to like how I relate to my neighbors, whether my trash gets picked up reliably, whether I can walk safely down the street, or whether I'm going to be harassed by police, or I mean like really anything,
Yeah, it sounds like we're all pretty much in agreement here that the conception of the political that maybe the status quo encourages is very artificially limited. And that's kind of the reason I ask that. I've definitely encountered a lot of folks who, to them, politics is electoral politics. So, like B said, who's the president? And, like a ballot initiative or trying to get someone elected to office, even like on a local level, that's politics, but that's where it ends. I told someone I was interested in political philosophy once, and the only thing she could think of was, oh, so you must be like watching the presidential campaign right now. So I want to sort of position electoral politics within the political rather than sort of artificially equating the two. So how would you see electoral campaigns within that framework? Where do they fit? What's their relationship to politics? Because they're not the same. It's like one is a part of the other. Well, I'm curious how you would define it.
I guess the example that all the three of us have been involved in is the uh, ballot campaign for rent control in Pasadena, and like uh, not to jump ahead, but like that campaign was sort of an expression of the political barriers that people we were running across in our kind of on the ground organizing of tenants in Pasadena. And so that campaign was sort of uh, establishing some tools and some enabling conditions that kind of expanded the realm of political possibility afterwards, and kind of were in the process of like seeing through that expansion of political possibility. And so I guess that election in particular was one where we were trying to like change what was what we could do in our political organizing, and it was a kind of it created a focal point where um, you could measure, like, this is what the sort of will of the people is at this moment. And so, yeah, I see the kind of electoral process as being a really like it's an important thing that can happen politically because it's very quantifiable, and then afterwards carries some legal weight, which then the sort of enforcement arms of the state that we tend to deal with all of a sudden have to abide in some way. And so, there's like a lot of power that's been kind of wrapped up in what happens in those elections. And so that kind of makes it one kind of like area where some kind of like politics can happen, I guess. But I guess it's not the only place that can happen.
Yeah, I think electoral politics or campaigns are obviously a piece of politics. But like Ryan said, it comes down to power and the dynamics between the people in power and the people at whole. And electoral stuff is definitely, I think, in the US, what people think of on a whole when they think of politics. And very frequently they don't think beyond that. But if you picked any one of them and said, name a country or a place that you think is super, dictator, fascist kind of thing, where very few elections, and you would ask them, like, are there politics there when there's no elections? And they would still be like, well yeah. So it's a part, but obviously not everything, because without elections or voting and stuff, there's still things happening. There's still power dynamics at play. They just look different.
Yeah, I mean, I think in our country, in the United States, and I'll amend that from saying our country, because I know that not everyone is from this country. I think the group of us on this call are, but in the United States, the system of government that we have really puts a lot of weight on electoral politics. And there is in some places, especially, very little that people can conceive of outside of electoral politics. And it's hard even at that, because there are so many barriers to participating in elections in this country from the founding of the country, which was, used to have to own property to be able to vote. And then, of course, you had to be a male and white. And little by little, we've chipped away at some of those, restrictions to voting, but they're now more informal barriers, like states are closing polling places, notably on near college campuses and in heavily Black and brown neighborhoods. It's harder and harder to vote by intention. And so I think especially in a system where, B mentioned like a fascist kind of government, where they may have elections, but it's all, we all kind of look at it and roll our eyes and be like, yeah, of course, the dictator was, won by 90%, like as if that's really a free and fair election. And so I think it's really incumbent upon people in our society today, especially, that we start to think of what the horizon of possibility is for us as political actors in the world, outside of elections. But, that being said, those like I think Aaron said, it does have legal weight, so if you can make a difference in a political environment, especially with a ballot initiative like what we did, where the ballot initiative isn't going to change its mind in 6 months. It's words on paper, and so it kind of is what it is. Whereas when you elect a person, they're subject to all sorts of influence. I think about the rent control measure in Burbank that was on the ballot in 2020 that lost 60-40. And then a couple of years later, we run almost the same thing and we win 54-46. And, what's the difference there? Well, the difference was, in my view at least, and this is overly simplified, but a lot more money was spent. Well, about the same amount of money was spent to defeat the measure in Burbank, but less money was spent on the pro rent control side. There was less, time and energy put into field And so it's not that the people in Pasadena, which is like 10 miles away, like rent control better than the people in Burbank. It's just that the conditions around that election were different, and people didn't hear the whole story in Burbank. And so therefore they voted against it, because what they really heard was, this is going to really screw up the city, you know? So you can poll people, and it just all depends on the conditions around that polling, right? Whether people express whether they even have access to the truth around, you know, what a thing is that they're deciding about.
Yeah, so I want to add one more thing about electoral politics, and in the particular context of the US, that, like we said before, a lot of folks kind of see it as all of politics, that it starts and ends there. And I think that is weaponized and works for the state and the people in power to show, like, this is all that politics is. It's voting once a year, maybe twice a year, in these very formalized elections. And this is it. This is where your power lies, just in this vote. You can't do anything outside of it to influence anything. And that's like purely benefits the people in power.
Yeah, and the kind of range of options is sort of so like limited and predetermined that then you hear a lot of people. I think this is sort of where the like the common refrain of "I'm not political" or "I'm," you know, if you ask someone to do something which is not just voting yes or no on these two parties, you know, when we were going around with the ballot, we would often hear again and again, like, "Oh, I don't get involved in politics. I'm not political." And I think a lot of that comes from the sort of disillusionment of the like having to make the same false choice and not really even having that much of an impact on the outcome of that false choice. And so then, like, you know, it's hard to continue like beating your head against that without seeing it as actually even having the possibility of leading to a substantively different outcome. And so, yeah, I think without expanding the realm of what is political, that's kind of the disillusionment that happens. So we have to definitely fight against that.
Yeah, that's really discouraging.
So, in the spirit of expanding the political, I want to talk about the landlord-tenant relationship, which I've definitely encountered a lot of tenants who don't understand that relationship as political, but I think it is really important to do so because it opens up a lot of political opportunities, a lot of ways you can build power. So, how should we understand the relationship between landlords and tenants? And also, if you just want to introduce the concept of a tenants union, I already did an episode on it, but I'm kind of curious, like, why they're so important, why they're a good use of our time and resources when it comes to having a political effect on the world.
I've learned so much from being in PTU, from, you know, my comrades here in this conversation as well as others. And I think what's so clear to me now that was really not clear to me, I would say 6 years ago, is just how fundamentally exploitative the relationship between landlords and tenants is. Even the nicest, sometimes tenants will say, "Oh, but I have a really nice landlord." But at the end of the day, they're participating in a process that is extracting passive income from working class people who are already having their wages being exploited in their wages. So it's just like a sucker punch. Like, it's that second, you know, punch, you know, your boss is keeping a sizable chunk of your labor production, and then you come home and your landlord is just siphoning off what's left. And you're basically like, can I afford food or medicine, you know, at the end of that. And it's just so, I don't want to say, you know, leave some room for others to comment, but that to me is just the first thing I think of when I hear people say, "Oh, but some landlords are okay." And it's not like, it's sort of like saying like all cops are bastards. You know, it's like, it's not literally that every cop is like, as an individual, a bad person. I'm sure that they love their children and probably are like, you know, help someone across the street, you know, whatever. They might be a decent person, but they're participating in a system that is fundamentally corrupt and broken and harmful and deadly to people.
I kind of always remember I don't know, this experience that happens regularly, but in particular, there was one protest that we were at with the PTU outside of some landlord's house who was, I don't remember, like wrongfully evicting someone or like jacking up their rent some ridiculous amount. And this was before there were any protections in Pasadena against these kinds of behaviors. And so we were just going to the landlord's house and making some noise and telling their neighbors what they did, because it was one of these cases where you obviously, if you're like a feeling human being, kind of like are repulsed by the sort of notion that someone for the sake of their passive income and increasing their passive income by 10% or something would like completely upend someone's life. And so we were out there making noise, and I remember their kid was there, maybe like 6 to 8 year old kid, and asked like me and someone else like what a like landlord was, and it's sort of a ridiculous kind of notion to explain to a child, like, oh, there's this other person who probably you never would see or want to see, certainly, and they own the place where I live, and then I send them money all the time, every month, like most of my paycheck, uh, and they do nothing for me. Um, it's sort of like it's a bizarre abstraction that everyone is sort of seems to be okay with, that there's someone who, like, in the best case scenario, you never interact with ever, and yet is entitled to, in upwards of 30%, and in many cases more than half of every dollar that you earn from work where you're already not being paid as much as the value that you're producing. So it's not a rational state of affairs, and I think it's something that kind of goes to the root of a lot of what like how power is sort of like transmitted and maintained in the United States in particular, like as a like country built on theft of land, and where property and the access to like specifically like land property has been such a tool for like dispossession and maintaining a class of people who have no other sort of out than to sell their labor at a decreasing rate of return. So that tenant landlord relationship is sort of the sort of most like immediate place where that happens on a month to month basis for most people.
Yeah, and on top of the lack of any sense of equivalent exchange of you giving them money for maybe a product or a service or their labor, basically there's nothing. In best cases, you rarely see them except for when they're fixing their toilet, your toilet, as they should. But they're not really providing anything. They had the wealth, very often ancestral wealth, and not like built up on their own through labor, to purchase a second home, or a third, or a fifth, or 100th. It's not even necessary for them, nor did they really even work for it. So, I guess there are a couple of landlords out there that rent their main home, which I don't understand. But these people just have more than they need, and then they extract even more from you for basically absolutely nothing in return.
Well, I mean, it's fundamentally like class war, isn't it? Like, we even use this expression landlord, which some people are trying to get people to stop using because it's so accurate and it's like clearly describes the relationship. It's a feudal relationship where, in history, when it was no longer in fashion for people to be literal slaves, they just indentured them to the land, right? And they had to farm for their subsistence, but the landlord just took like half of it. So if they grew like potatoes and onions, then the landlord just said, okay, I'll take half of that. Thanks. Without doing anything, except that they just happened to be in this position where they had ownership. I mean, the whole concept of ownership is really what's behind all of this.
And the relationships today are exactly like as they say were before and have grown out of the very long history of wealth and ownership. It's not everybody was given the same chance to own a plot of land. Very specific people got it, and they've literally just passed it on to their children through generations. And the folks that are doing the labor to produce some wealth for their family and buy their home, not an extra passive income, but the one home where they want to have their family, like, are just coming into that wealth. And the folks that own everybody else's homes have literally owned that land since the start of the so-called United States. So it's been one-sided from the very beginning, and still is, like, even through all the so-called progress. But we had the explicit, like, landowners can vote. So even in that, like, very small view of politics, of electoral politics being all of it, landlords are so at the core of that. Even they were the ones that could vote, specifically the white males. And after that, we made some gains in who's voting, but then there's all the redlining and who they're going to give loans to. And it's like, well, who is that? So it's just from the ground up, forwards, backwards, any way you look at it, it's like exploitative and political.
It's hard to convince middle income, average Americans of that. But once they look at it, we've seen in PTU a lot of people who come to PTU because they're getting screwed by their landlord, but they're not quite on board with the idea that landlording is fundamentally exploitative. But then they spend a few shifts on the hotline and they're like, okay, I see now, like it's easy to radicalize people because you don't have to teach them anything, right? They just look at their own personal experience and the experience of other people. And it's like, got it.
So that brings me to the rent control campaign. I think it's fair to say that was a big part of the campaign, was just getting people to realize that the cost of living here is a problem. Rent is too high. Like, when it comes to rent control, what you're arguing there is that, like, the rental market in an area is such that rent control is necessary. So I want to talk about what the trends were in Pasadena around the time that you started the campaign, why the situation was ripe for rent control. And I know that there were also a couple tries to get this on the ballot, and finally the last one was successful. But if you want to talk about, like, the difference between the unsuccessful attempts and the one that finally passed this fall.
So in Pasadena, the rents were increasing, at least for the several years before 2022 when we ran the rent control campaign, were increasing faster than anywhere else in LA County. It was something that, I think was largely could be chalked up to the fact that LA County and the city of LA and various municipalities in LA County other than Pasadena and kind of many other of the peripheral cities around LA. A lot of the other cities had rent control or had some kind of, like, ability for people to put the brakes a bit on housing costs. And in Pasadena, we didn't have that. We also didn't have any eviction protection, so folks could be kind of kicked out at any time. And Pasadena is a sort of has a lot of high tech industry that kind of comes in, and like a lot of focus from folks kind of in the political class on kind of growing positive business environment and making it a place which is profitable for people to do business and bring in kind of high paid professionals. And I think the combination of those trends and then sort of the historic segregation in the city where, yeah, like various parts of the city had been redlined before, and like in particular, like Northwest Pasadena it was historically one of the only places in LA County where Black folks could own homes. And so I think what we were seeing a lot of was those places kind of being chipped away at. There had been a lot of development sort of in that area, including this, like, historic case of eminent domain that was used to build like a stub of a freeway and displace a whole lot of people several decades ago. So we were seeing kind of a really rapid gentrification in Pasadena, and not a lot of tools for people to really stop it or address it. And so that was sort of one, yeah, I mean, that's how I see the sort of stage being set for something like rent control to be really popular.
I just looked up in the findings, which is part of the Measure H, the Article 18, which passed. There's several pages at the beginning which sort of sets out the case. And I always have to look this up because I don't remember these numbers very easily. But in the 6-year period between 2012 and 2018, rents went up by 32%, whereas the consumer price index for our region went up 12.4%. So we're, effectively a 17.5% increase in rent over 6 years, which is just, outpacing. And I mean, not a 17.5% increase in rent, but a 17.5% over the consumer price index. So, rapidly rising faster than any other consumer products like gasoline and food and clothes and everything else. So it's just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, important to note that the consumer price index also includes some piece of rent too. So rent in Pasadena is going up way more than other products in general, and the other bundle of rent in general. And another kind of maybe measure of the changing city that we could look at is the rapid decline in enrollment in Pasadena public schools. I don't remember exactly the numbers, but if you plot the rise in starting rents with the decrease of enrollment in public schools in Pasadena, it goes perfectly line, one for one. And, largely the families that are being pushed out are Black or brown. And the white families are able to stay, able to afford their place, and probably also largely send their kids to private schools as well.
Yeah, the Black percentage of the population in Pasadena is down to less than 9%, where it was around 30% in the 80s. So you can see gentrification happening right in front of your eyes.
Yeah, that's huge.
Yeah. And in addition to, all the things we know about how Black or brown people are pushed out or not afforded the same opportunities, especially when it comes to home ownership, there was that period of heavy, like very distinct redlining all over LA. But in addition to that, there was a period of time where Black people could own homes, but not occupy them in Pasadena. They were not allowed to live in the home that they had the deed to. They had to be a landlord instead of a resident, which is a really weird thing. We're allowing them to participate in capitalism and be the capitalist, but not be a neighbor.
Given that situation, what did Measure H bring to Pasadena renters that was so necessary? So could you talk a little bit about why rent control and eviction protections are so great? Like maybe more specifically what Measure H provides, and why you felt that was so important to address the situation in Pasadena, both with the accelerating cost of rent and also trends like gentrification.
So we've had in the Pasadena Tenants Union, as long as I've been around, which I think was about 6 or 7 years, what we called our solidarity team or solidarity hotline, which is kind of the main place that people reach out to when they hear about PTU. Usually they're in some crisis, and very often it's a ridiculous rent increase, an eviction, or just straight up harassment, assault, discrimination. And over the years, we very regularly get many calls, largely, like I would say a huge percentage of those calls come from Black and brown families specifically. And we've just seen like case after case after case of all sorts of landlord things, and some distinct patterns of tactics they use, laws, loopholes in the laws that they use to further exploit or hurt people. And basically that was sort of the basis of what was what informed the law, the Measure H. And actually, so there, as you mentioned, there's a previous sort of attempt at rent control through the ballot, where a law was written based again on experience of what people were coming to PTU and telling us, and then it was more expanded on and refined specifically to target those loopholes that landlords were using, and very, very detailed, like, we know exactly what they're doing and we're going to write it in there word for word to stop those holes and plug them up.
Yeah, so the law, which is now Article 18 of the Pasadena City Charter, limits rent increases year to year. So if you are living in a place, basically you can only get a rent increase once a year, whether you're on a year lease or a month-to-month lease. So if you're on month-to-month, you're not kind of always worrying that the rent could go up at any time. There are kind of very, par for the course, but robust like requirements on noticing you of rent increases, and the rent can only be increased up to 75% of the annual inflation. So if you're living at a place long term and you're kind of a long term community member, you're going to kind of feel that the rent is getting less expensive relative to other things that you need to buy in your life. So it's definitely encourages sort of long term commitment to the community, and this is certain, like, minimally just, right? Like if you're a homeowner, in California, your property tax can't go up like some large amount, and typically if you're on a fixed income or a fixed rate mortgage, you're not going to be paying more and more at a rate which is far outpacing inflation. So these are kind of standard kind of expectations for property owners, and it's sort of bringing that to some small degree to tenants. And then the law also has really strong eviction protections. So you can only be kicked out of your home for some fairly narrow set of reasons, which largely are dictated by what is kind of required. So like lack of payment, for example, if there is a government order to vacate the property, something like that, or a few requirements that kind of are there to comply with state law. So basically, if you live in a place, you have the right to continue living there, except for some kind of narrow set of circumstances. And you need both of those things, because if you don't have the eviction protections and the landlord wants to raise the rent but can't because you're living there, they could just kick you out and then get someone new and raise the rent to whatever they want. And similarly, if you have the eviction protections but you don't have the rent control, if the landlord wants to evict you but they can't because of the eviction protections, they could just raise your rent to some level that you wouldn't be able to pay, and then you'd be forced to leave anyway, and they'd effectively be able to evict you. So these kind of two properties of the law are really important to have together. So that's kind of the two core pillars of the measure.
One other, I think, really important thing to mention is that if you talk to any tenant who has some issues that need to be addressed by the landlord, especially this is the case when the lower income the tenants happen to be, or again, black and brown tenants. If you ask them, have you contacted your landlord about that? They'll often say no, because, and then they'll say some range of things, right? Either, well, the landlord will just raise the rent a bunch, or they'll retaliate by trying to kick me out, because the last thing a landlord wants is a tenant that complains about repairs all the time. Or they'll just harass them in other ways, by starting to be super picky. Or like if you call the landlord and say, I have mold growing in my bathroom, or in my kitchen, then they would say, well, if you were a better housekeeper, you wouldn't have this problem, or something like that. And so it's just this shaming and intimidation and harassment. And what the rent control and just cause eviction protections gives tenants is the ability to stand up for themselves without the fear of that immediate retaliation. Of course, there are many ways that landlords will be creative and harass you anyway, and it's always going to depend on the tenant asserting their rights. So a passive tenant will always be a target for harassment, but these protections really give a tenant the right to say, no, you have to come and fix the plumbing in my bathroom that's leaking and causing the floorboards to rot. Like, we're not going to put up with this. And the landlord can't be like, okay, out you go, or whatever. So
on that subject, one of the really interesting things about Measure H, which is now Article 18, is the right that tenants have to organize. So there's a there's a protection in the law that assures that tenants have the right to organize, to assert their rights, and that those sorts of retaliations are illegal. So I'd love to hear a more detailed explanation of that, and also how the law is going to help with future organizing efforts, how it's going to have this nice synergy with the tenants union and further the work that they do.
Well, yeah, just on the right to organize. I mean, that's kind of what I was alluding to in my comment a moment ago. So, but more specifically, if a landlord tries to evict a tenant within a year, I think it is, of the tenant organizing an association in their building or joining the tenants union as a member, or working in any way with the tenants union to address their issues, that's a presumed retaliation for that organizing, and it is a defense against that eviction in court.
And not only is it just evictions, actual evictions, it protects them against anything that the landlord would do after the tenant's organizing. So a threat of an eviction, a change in services, harassing them to, not allow them for their quiet enjoyment. Basically, any negative response to you organizing is illegal or can be used as a defense in court, which is amazing. And some of these basic protections and things, especially around organizing, really help. They're not a given in a lot of places and scenarios. They're even like explicitly like banned or encouraged against those things, and that really helps the Pasadena Tenants Union to organize, because we know it's protected. We can tell folks that aren't brought into the fold yet that you can fight against your landlord, and if you fight, you are protected. Actually, you're more protected if you fight back. Now, rather than just sitting back and taking it, or not wanting to deal with the hassle and moving out because you're able to find a new place, that's great, or you're able to hire a new lawyer. That's not the case for everybody. And being able to tell people that now in the law, written in law, you are entitled to certain behaviors, certain powers, really helps to get people in, because the number one thing is just the fear of losing your home, or the hassle of going through it, or the fear of going to court and having that show up on what record, who knows where, or whatever. Like, those things are really hard to deal with. They're very confusing. They're really unsettling and can really, really affect your life. And having it in law and just on paper that says you're protected if you do these things, especially like it is assumed retaliation if the landlord does these things after you fight and organize for like a whole year. It's assumed retaliation. That is, I think, a huge comfort and security that we can rely on now, and help encourage people to fight back, especially those folks that are otherwise, there's a lot of people that already have that will and drive and are already fighting back despite, prior lack of protections. But convincing folks, especially those people that already need to be convinced that they deserve secure, joyful, healthy housing, is a task. And I think this just really helps with that. It helps bring peace of mind to people, to bring the clarity and calmness they need to begin in the struggle. Is amazing.
Yeah, and I think it really ties in with the conversation we started with about expanding the realm of the political. I think the
Mm.
main reason all of us and the tenants union in particular got involved with this and kind of committed to this really long-term effort to change the law and change the organizing conditions is because, we were seeing that people would come into the tenants union, they would be facing a crisis where they were being pushed out of their home through eviction or through like huge rent increases. And in the long run, there was not a lot that they could do or we could do to stop that. We could like, you know, help them talk with their neighbors and maybe organize some like PR campaign and in order to kind of convince their landlord to not be so abusive. But, especially when you're going up against large corporate landlords and like so much of the housing is owned by like out of town wealthy corporations. It's not in the long run a super effective tactic. And so eventually they would get radicalized. They would kind of come to understand that they should have some political power in this domain of housing, and that there are like, the vast majority of the other people in their city and elsewhere are sort of in the same boat. And I think this measure gives us the ability to gives the people who come into the tenants union the ability to, in the long run, fight back and win, and see that when they talk with their neighbors, they are expanding the realm of what they can do politically, and it's really exciting that kind of possibility is available to folks now. And I think we haven't even really like seen the full sort of flourishing and outcome of that. Like there are a lot of little pieces of this law which are really exciting, like the right to organize. We've essentially made it a misdemeanor in Pasadena to break this law. So if you are retaliating against someone for organizing, there can be like fairly severe consequences to harassing your tenants or trying to give them an illegal rent increase or an illegal eviction, and sort of using your position of experience and knowledge of the legal system around housing and the tenants' typical like lack of like legal backing and sort of legal knowledge of what their rights are. We're really flipping the tables on how that interaction typically plays out, and giving people the ability to have really concrete and firm wins when they try to assert their rights to dignified housing.
Yeah, I think this measure, Article 18, really helps to level the playing field, like, maybe just a tiny bit in the whole scheme of things, but enough that, we're not twisting our ankle and taking a fall on every small dip here and there, that we can actually have some ground to run on and to make gains. And, like Aaron said, we made it basically a misdemeanor, like change the narrative, whether or not a bunch of landlords in Pasadena end up going to jail or getting filed with a misdemeanor, like changing the narrative in law that this is not a civil matter. These are crimes against individual people and against humanity. People are being assaulted, like literally assaulted. They're being poisoned by various construction and literal poisoning attempts, like through carbon monoxide, and being thrown out onto the street to die. So, this isn't a civil matter. It's not $500. You stole my catalytic converter, even though that's kind of expensive too. But, this is direct impacts on people's life and health. And it should be seen with such respect and severity. And in addition to, the stopgap measures of throwing out bogus evictions and making rent increases not just free willy, like whatever they want to do, it establishes a rental housing board, which basically makes some small structure in the government that deals directly with rental housing and only with rental housing. And that board exists so people can fight back. So they, have some measure within government even to fight back. That board has the power to hire attorneys to even sue landlords on the behalf of tenants, so they don't have to go through themselves if they don't have that power, time, or energy. And it also provides an opportunity for tenants to say, look, I'm paying you this much a month to get the things that you specified in the lease, like any other sort of business, right? I gave you this money for this product, and you're not coughing up. Like, you won't repair the things you said you would repair. Basic law says I deserve a functioning toilet and hot water and no mold, and I'm not getting any of those things. So either you take less money from me or no money, or you get in trouble. And then you can go to the rental board and say these things are happening and get a decrease, a downward adjustment of rent, if the landlord doesn't do the fixes or doesn't provide what they told you they would provide in a contract, like any other business that they say they are operating, like that they're putting in labor to produce something for you. So, whether or not the law itself and the court and the government behave exactly how we want and how it's specified in the law, at the very least, it starts changing the narrative and allows people to imagine something a little bit different, which I think is just a small step in the cultural changes we need, and internal changes we need to work on these things and make better scenarios.
I mean, what's remarkable when you get to where Pasadena is now, and we're a long ways still from implementing, like having the rent board put together and actually running. But even from this vantage point, when I look back at when I was evicted from my apartment and there was zero protections for that, or when PJ, one of our members, was evicted from her apartment and all of her neighbors, there was nothing stopping that from happening. And, the types of abuses that B is describing, like dangerous, like literally dangerous to your life and health kind of situations, there's nobody in the government looking out for you. It's just this volunteer organization, the Tenants Union, that's kind of trying their best to get the attention of people in authority who can actually enforce the law. Code enforcement is what it is, but they're behind and takes forever, and sometimes they just gloss over things. And it's truly remarkable when you think about how many jurisdictions across this country don't have rent control and therefore don't have a rent board, and all the kinds of protections that we're talking about, which shouldn't be like headline news, really. It should just be like, tenant gets to live, like tenant entitled to roof overhead, kind of like, wow, that's breaking news. Like, this is like a massive win for the left, like that people can't be thrown out of their apartments for no reason, literally no reason, so it's wild that these things are huge achievements. And yet when you look across the country at just the rampant abuse by property owners, it's just appalling. I mean, you have a Consumer Protection Bureau at the federal level kind of trying to look out for people being gouged by this and that type of business. But, when was the last time a landlord was, indicted on, endangering the life of his or her tenants? It just doesn't happen.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's just astounding, like how defenseless on average tenants are, and how, even though this is supposed to be a contractual relationship with mutual obligations, it really doesn't play out like that. I do want to talk about big achievements, though. I know, like, this shouldn't have to be a big achievement, but it kind of was. You had to get 15,000 verified signatures from Pasadena residents in order to actually get this on the ballot, and then you had to get enough people to vote yes to make it into law. So I wanted to really quickly talk about, like, just the scope of this campaign, how much work and time and money and effort and all of this it took, and why you think it was finally successful, like after the attempts that didn't quite get off the ground, why this one was really enough to not only like expand people's sense of the political, but get them to vote yes on this thing. Like that, I do think that is an incredible accomplishment. And if you guys just want to brag a little bit about that.
Yeah, let me get us started, and then there's so much to say about this. I mean, I think the first thing to say is that for a long, long time, polling has suggested that Pasadena is in favor of rent control and just cause. We've known for a while. The majority of the voters in Pasadena, if you were just looking at Pasadena, voted yes on Prop 10. when it was an effort to repeal a law at the state level that really inhibits rent control from applying to more units. It's complicated to explain to voters the repeal of that law. It's kind of like in the weeds a little bit, and yet majority of Pasadena voters voted yes on that repeal. Our first effort at rent control was set for the 2018 ballot, but fell short of the number of signatures, as you indicated. It takes a lot of signatures. We needed around 13,300 and some, and got 15,100 verified signatures. So we were about 13% over our target, which was something we did intentionally to make sure that we wouldn't fall short. There's a lot of technicalities that go into collecting signatures. They have to be valid, which means you need to be registered at the address that you're writing on the petition form. So if your signature is you and you are indeed registered to vote, but not at that address, it's canceled. If they can't read it, it's canceled. If you pay rent faithfully, but you're not registered to vote, it's canceled. So all those signatures get duplicates. Of course, there are a lot of duplicates. So we had to gather almost over 20,000 signatures to get 15,000 valid ones to cover the 13,000 some that we needed to qualify. So we finally did that. It was a Herculean effort. And I think we mobilized around 300 and some volunteers for the signature gathering effort. Most of these are just ordinary Pasadena residents, just people that had probably never done this in their life before. There were some comrades, some supporters from Los Angeles City and other San Gabriel Valley cities nearby that were a part of one of our organizations that supported us. And then I think we added on another 300 volunteers during the election campaign part. So it ended up being over 600 people that helped pitch in some form or fashion. We ended up raising about $500,000 to pay largely for mail. That's the most expensive thing that we did. We could have done television ads or streaming ads, which would have been more expensive than mail, but we didn't do that for strategic reasons, but also just lack of money to do that. So it took a lot, and we had over 100 endorsing organizations from around the region, most of them from Pasadena, but also the surrounding area. So yeah, it was a huge citywide effort.
Yeah, during the signature gathering campaign, we also, like Ryan said, needed about something over 13,000 signatures, had 300 volunteers mobilized during that period, and we had one part-time paid coordinator, and that was about it. And additionally, a big chunk of money we had to raise to just hire a signature gathering firm to also go out and get signatures, which is a challenge for these firms. Typically, they don't do really local campaigns. And Pasadena is got about 130,000 people. So it's very different than having a firm go out just to LA, where there's always people about, there's tons of people. In Pasadena, we went out every single weekend, and people were out, almost every day for a solid year. Every single weekend we organized canvases, both Saturday and Sunday. We had people going out on every holiday, on Thanksgiving, Christmas, and in a smaller area like this, you kind of exhaust the people in the public places. I think Pasadena on the various kind of social media and places, you kind of just hear from people, they're like, had never seen this much politics forced in their face. Because when you're doing anything other than a local campaign, you don't send canvassers to Pasadena for very long. You don't focus all of your mailers to Pasadena voters. So we really had to get up in the face of Pasadenans, because they are largely, not considering the tenants, kind of more conservative or more wealthy, so maybe liberal, but pretty satisfied, so they don't have to worry too much. I think a huge portion of winning this time, it was a combination of us getting our act together and being committing to winning, and being like, this is it. We can't keep trying this year after year. This is it. So it's now or never. So let's kick ourselves into gear. And thankfully, we did a silly little fundraiser yard sale that pushed us just over the amount of, I don't know, $2,000 or so dollars we needed to kind of hire some campaign consultants. And so, yeah, I think a huge shout out to them. This is Redbridge Strategies, who have won campaigns in the past. And so coming to a group of, not a group of campaigners, it's a group of tenant organizers. Some folks have had some experience in electoral campaigns, but not designing and running their whole campaign. And having Redbridge Strategies help us out and basically meet with us for an hour every week after week, being like, where are you guys at? Are you doing it? You need to go back out there. And basically handling a lot of kind of the messaging design, because so much work goes in just the messaging alone, and money to mail those things out too, that I don't think we would have been able to do that all on our own. Even just finding the right printing press, and we would have spent all of our time debating what should go on a mailer. I'm sure of it. That would have never ended. And then once we got on the ballot, the help of some key groups, particularly for the funding and publicity, really got us going. But it was majorly getting out there very early and talking to voters, and them having seen us for the past year collecting signatures at the grocery store and at their door. So it was many, many repeat touches, and people being like, oh, I've heard of that group. Oh, you guys are the Pasadena Tenants, or you're with the Tenants or whatever. You guys, oh yeah, you're good people. I'll sign that. My friend mentioned something about that, or I've seen you around. Whereas the conversation around the opposition campaign was like, none. A, they came out very, very late, and B, it was like, oh, they just threw all of their flyers over my yard and, made it really messy, and they were rude. And, they have no community support. None of the people in that campaign, I haven't seen them around. I don't know who they are. I don't think they live in Pasadena. And it's absolutely necessary, basically, to talk to neighbors and to talk to them a lot, beyond what they're really willing to do, listen to you, and beyond what feels comfortable as a normal person to go do. But that's what it takes. Even though, electoral campaigns are the only politics you can do in America, you really have to really engage people to get them to do it. Very simple task that really needs a lot of convincing, surprisingly.
I think people are really used to seeing the big billion-dollar presidential campaigns as the main area of politics. And so when you don't have $1 billion to design your mailers, I think basically having that input from Redbridge Strategies and kind of the ability to run a professional campaign and come across to people like, oh, this is a professional operation and people have put thought into this. Obviously, our expertise in the tenants union is organizing tenants in their buildings and kind of fighting for tenants' rights. It's not putting together kind of flashy mailers and things. And so, yeah, I think that was really crucial for foot in the door with people, especially homeowners who are not the focus of our organizing, to say okay, this is not just it just reads as something that they could start to understand. And then with tenants, I think we have a lot more base of support there. There are a lot of buildings that we had maybe some direct experience with, but it's also, I think I talked with a lot of people who they would be in support of rent control or something, but they'd tell me something like, well, yeah, even if that passes, they're never going to actually not raise the rent. They're, even if that's the law, they're just going to break the law. Or just oh, yeah, rent control, they've been trying to do that here for 30, 40 years. It's never going to happen. And this is possibly even after it was on the ballot, that this was it had never gotten onto the ballot before. People had never had the chance to vote on this before. They'd just seen the various petitions come and go. And so just convincing people that, it's real this time, was, yeah, pretty challenging to break through that just sense of disillusionment with not having the political power, and to show that actually yeah, this one is for real. It took, I mean, definitely like a core group of 10 to 30 people who were really committed to going out 2 days a weekend, going canvassing, like literally tens and tens of thousands of volunteer hours across a full year plus, not to mention the writing process and all of the like coalition building and stuff that happened before. Um, you know, tens of thousands of phone calls, tens of thousands of door knocks. I was tallying it up, and like I think I delivered like 344 yard signs, which was pretty fun to like drive around and to deliver all the yard signs. And then, you know, these are real relationships that we have with people. These are not just like, you know, even though it's like you don't have you're talking, you have to get 15,000 signatures, so you're not talking for an hour with 15,000 people, but you know, it's now a relationship where we talked with people, you know, we assuaged their concerns, we explained like why we were doing this and why the community needs this, and like definitely often, you know, much of the time would hear from them why they personally needed or wanted something like this, whether it was like so that their kids or grandkids could live in the same place that they were able to, you know, buy housing in the 80s when it wasn't as expensive, or whether they had been facing like landlord harassment and that. But so yeah, these are real relationships, and like going back to them 6 months later, you can see sort of the amazement that we actually like followed through on our like political promise, and now this thing is the law, and it wasn't, you know, signing this piece of paper and putting up the yard side wasn't just like a one-off that like every other thing that they've engaged with in politics then just kind of disappeared and did nothing. I think is I don't know, you could see how refreshing and new that was. So yeah, really exciting to actually have built these kind of relationships, and these like kind of started this process of hope kind of in a lot of different corners in the city.
I've had people tell me that, you know, that we, or, you know, the campaign has transformed politics in Pasadena. And talk about politics, coming back to your original question. And just to underline everything that B and Aaron is saying, like, I think a lot of people today think, you know, or approach activism and, you know, as activism, like if you just have a good social media campaign, you can convince a bunch of people. But it's really the difference between activism and organizing, where you really go out and meet the people that you're trying to persuade and actually engage in political conversations with them. Even if you lose that conversation, even if it doesn't go your way, you've challenged that person to think about somebody besides themselves, somebody in a different class than them, a different position in life, maybe even remind them of what it was like when they were a renter, perhaps years before. I mean, those are really valuable. Even if you never see that person again, those are valuable conversations that I don't, at least here in Pasadena, don't happen very often. You know, there's 15 or 20 people that come to city council every week and make public comment, you know, but 15 to 20 people is not, you know, 90,000 voters. It's a much broader thing that you have to do to persuade people who frankly are busy doing their life. They don't care about, you know, sure, they may care about renters, but they're never going to know that the thing's even on the ballot if you don't knock on their door 3 times and deliver 6 pieces of, you know, literature and then call them. And they're like, okay, for God's sake, like, I'm going to vote, you know, like that's what it takes. That's what you have to do. And it's exhausting just hearing the story told again and participating and telling it. I'm like, I want to go take a nap after this.
Yeah, I don't want to keep you guys here forever. I know this has already gone on for a while. We only talked about like half of the questions on here. We could do a whole other episode, but we don't have to do them back to back. I did want to ask real quick if you have any advice for tenants unions or other radical organizations who are thinking about engaging in the electoral process. Like, are there upsides or downsides to it? How would they know that this would be a good idea? Maybe if there are any regrets or things that you were really glad happened that helped you along.
I think one of the things, you know, we've done a number of kind of interviews and presentations about the campaign now, and because we're only allotted a certain amount of time, we can only touch on some things. And I think we have to be really clear that this was a long process and a long time coming for Pasadena. We've alluded to it, like, the conversation started like in the 70s. There were tenants in the city trying to tell city council that we needed rent control, we needed some tenant protections. So it didn't just explode one day. And we even had the previous ballot initiative attempt. And so while we won Measure H in 2022, and we submitted the writing of the law in 2021, it makes it sound like it's a 2-ish year process, but it's been much longer than that. The law that we got passed was sort of modified and rebuilt from the previous measure that was that we tried to pass. And so that had the huge basis kind of was already made for the law itself. Probably started writing that maybe 2016 or so. I don't really remember. I wasn't part of that at the time. So it's been at least a solid 6 years. But the other part of that is, even before you think about a campaign, you really need to think about your city or municipality that you're trying to pass, and how big is it? The smaller it is, I don't know if it's a linear relationship, actually. It gets weird. When you're a medium size or a smaller place, like, there's only a certain amount of people out there that A, can even vote, B, that still live here and would even hear about it, that do actively vote, and that you can convince. And I think a lot of focus should be first put into building your base. If you don't have a tenants union yet, if you don't have a housing group or anybody in an organized fashion thinking about or talking about these issues, it's gonna be really hard. So we've had years of trying this, having the conversations, and having a tenants union, and building a base so that people are having the conversation, or at least people know that there are tenants that exist in the city that are facing issues and that we wanted to change. Is a huge part of it. Is really just building that base. Start talking to people first before you even put pen to paper to write a law, or file the papers to say you want to do that.
I would also just say that I think doing a really thorough power analysis of your city is really important. There's a good chance that if people are considering a ballot initiative, they've spent some time thinking about the makeup of their elected body, whether it's a city council or whatever, and who the potential allies might be, who the enemies are, and who maybe the swing votes might be, people that might be persuadable. It's certainly cheaper and more time efficient to persuade your city council to do what their job is to do, which is to make laws that promote the welfare of the majority of the people or all of the people in the city. And in most cases, the landlords that own the property in any given city don't live in that city, and so it's not hard to make the case that city council members, or whatever the jurisdiction is, have a duty to protect their residents. And if you can do that, that's great. And there's vigilance is required no matter how you do it, whether it's a ballot initiative or a city council movement, a motion that is made, or an ordinance. In our case, there's a rent board. So just because we won Measure H didn't mean we were done. We had to, work on getting people appointed to the rent board. And of course, all the organizing that was just discussed. People have rights, but if they're not politically inclined to enforce their own rights, then what good are they? So there's always more work to be done. And I think if people have a sense of who are the power brokers in the community, not just the elected officials, but like who are the nonprofit organizations that wield a lot of influence, that when they talk, people listen. Who are the racial justice organizations in your community, and what are they talking about? Are there other groups that mobilize around labor and workers' rights, and other types of groups that are fighting for similar, anti-poverty type of things? And can you start talking to those people and see what they're doing? I mean, the last thing you want to do as, a new group is to, barge into a city and act like you've got the answers when people have been fighting for these things as in Pasadena for 20, 30 years. It's really important to kind of do that research and find out like who's talking about housing, and are they just talking about building more housing, which is a totally different conversation, or are they talking about tenant rights and really building on the resources that you have, kind of doing a thorough survey of those resources, I think is really smart. And then just kind of seeing where you're at, because you can learn a lot from those people. You could think that you're going to persuade the city council, and you can learn from people that, look, we've been, banging on that door for 20 years. And so that could save you a lot of time too.
Yeah, I think it's really important to sort of figure out what your kind of horizon is. Like, I think for us, a lot of the people who are most involved in the campaign are definitely socialists, communists, people who, a bunch of anarchists, people who, our political horizon is not having landlords anymore, and having people own the housing in the city of Pasadena and elsewhere. So I don't think it would have made sense for us to do this amount of work for a sort of marginal kind of change to the wealth distribution in the city, for example. I think the reason we did this measure and did it in this way, which is a charter amendment, and it can't be, changed by an act of the council, was because the council the council laughed at the very idea that there would be rent control in Pasadena. It was an absolute political impossibility. And so we made this law that will change the conditions for organizing in the city. It's something that like sets up the preconditions that you would need to like really organize like a working class movement of tenants in the city. And so I think that kind of analysis of like, what are you really trying to get out of it is why there were so many people who were committed enough to it to actually make it happen. I think if the stakes are lower and then there's just fewer people who are willing to put pretty much everything else in their life on the back burner for a good amount of time for something like this, is I think for something like this to work, I don't know if it's fully necessary, but for us it was necessary to have such a political horizon where we were making like a fairly like fundamental change to the organizing conditions, because it really, like, the amount of work that it takes to do a ballot initiative, like this whole process is set up to make like poor people fail at it, like working people fail at it. You're not supposed to be able to do this in the American political system, in the American electoral system, I should say. And so, yeah, if you're going to sort of go through all of that, I think it's important to have a political horizon which is broad enough that the commitment that enough people will make is large enough that you have a very good chance of winning, because it's really hard and it's, I think, devastating to lose in that situation, and to make sure that the work that you do along the way is also moving you towards your political goals. Like for us, the amount of canvassing that we were doing, like, created, like, even if we had lost this campaign, we had talked with enough tenants that there would have been some serious progress in our organizing from having had so much direct conversation and like shoulder to shoulder struggle with tenants in the city, that like this was it, even like if the vote hadn't gone our way at the end, it would have been we would have been able to get a lot out of it as an organization and as a tenants movement in Pasadena. So I think like both of those things, like making sure it's you're going to get a lot out of it if you win, in order to convince people to commit to it, and also that even if you lose, like you have some exit strategy where you've still advanced the kind of objectives of the organization and the struggle.
Cool. I'm going to go ahead and close out by asking you what utopia looks like to you. You can interpret that however you want. I know it's a contentious term. That's kind of why I like it. So if anyone is interested in B's view of utopia, I'll refer you back to that episode. But Ryan and Aaron, I'd love to hear from you guys.
I like this question. I'm often kind of mired in observing the dystopia that we're living in. So, uh, no landlords, like I don't know. My view of utopia is having people in control of their own lives and engaged in community because it's something that enriches their lives and the lives of the people around them. Uh, so no private property, personal property, but no private property, no exploitation of people for profit. Yeah.
Yeah, likewise, I don't think about this very often. I think something that the left, and I can only speak about the left in the United States. I think needs to lean harder into the notion of freedom as sort of the central like value. For some reason, and we could document those reasons. The right has sort of co-opted this expression of freedom as a freedom to, freedom for them to do whatever they want and harm people. But I think really the notion of freedom comes down to, as my friend Martin Hageland says, has more to do with our time and the amount of time that we spend being exploited, both at work and at home. So my vision of utopia would at least include like a clear sense that people get to sort of like what Aaron said too, like to do what they want with their time. That would be an indication that we're getting closer to utopia for me, is that working class people say when surveyed, roughly, for example, I get a significant amount of time every week to do what I want. And that would be an amazing indicator to me that people have free time. They do the work that they've chosen to do because it means something to them and they get some value out of it. They're not being exploited at work. They're in control of their own labor and they reap the results of their own labor, not enriching a boss. And of course in the area of housing, that people are not exploited for their need to simply live. And, healthcare is provided for everyone. There's, there are beautiful things that people can enjoy, like, I don't know, parks and smog-free air and clean water and not just clean water, but abundant water, like water that we can count on for some time to come. And, just all the things that are necessary to live are available to people who haven't chosen a profession which was designed to make them ridiculously rich. Just ordinary people like you. And it's not so long ago, actually, that, even in our capitalist society, people could work at a minimum wage job and buy a house. My parents did that.
So my training is as a physicist, and I think a lot of people get into that because they're very curious about how the universe works and some very like deep existential questions about our place in the world, in the universe, and are very excited about answering these sort of like lofty philosophical questions that people have been wondering about for a long time. And what tends to happen is that you can't make any money doing that for the like vast majority of very qualified like smart physicists out there. And I think similarly, like, and I see it as sort of like an artistic pursuit. Like it's something that you engage in because it makes the world more beautiful and meaningful. And I think it's something that, like, as humanity, we like. I think the only like we want it to be something that we can engage in and think about. And I think it makes the whole like reason for us being here on the planet like more valuable for everyone, that there are some people who are thinking about that. And I think instead, like the main thing that determines who gets to do that is like who can write some proposals that you might be able to spin into some technology that's going to make people like insanely wealthy or kill a bunch of people through like targeted missiles or something. And I think like it's pretty disgusting that we live in a society that turns something that people are jumping onto for like I think typically fairly like I don't know, like aesthetic reasons or like fairly pure reasons is like the only way to actually do it in a practical sense is to do something like fairly like horrifying. And I think and if you end up like continuing in academia and like actually the bulk of your work is sort of answering those questions, the conditions of your work are going to be bad, because you're not going to have enough money to do it essentially. And yeah, I would like a world where people can do artistic pursuits that make their lives and the lives of people around them more meaningful, because because they have that control over their working conditions, and because the society values that instead of concentration of wealth.
That really speaks to me. Thank you for that answer.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I really enjoyed this conversation, Luca. I really appreciate it.
Solarpunk Now is written, hosted, and produced by me, Luca Dowell. The Solarpunk theme song is by Red Keener on SoundCloud. My guests today were B, Ryan, and Aaron of the Pasadena Tenants Union, one of the major players in passing Measure H. You can learn more about PTU at pasadenatenantsunion.org. Follow me on Twitter at SolarpunkCast, Mastodon at SolarpunkCast at spore.social, or visit solarpunkcast.net for all episodes including show notes. You can also visit solarpunkcast.net to donate to the show. Running a podcast takes time and money, and I do all of this myself, so your support is greatly appreciated. That's solarpunkcast.net, link in the description. And remember, the realization of any vision requires action. I strongly encourage you to get involved with local organizations whose goals align with the brighter future you want to see. Analysis is important, but we have to back it up with practice. Keep dreaming big, and keep up the good work.